west. There's a document called the Didache. It's an early document. I actually had to work on translating the Didache as part of my Greek examination for doctoral studies. A mess trying to remember my Greek well enough to translate it. It probably comes from Syria, but aspects also fit in Egyptian context, so it's a little dicey. The episcopoi and the bishops and priests, we'll just keep using the English words, appear, but prescriptions over prophets and teachers and deacons also appear. Although St. Ignatius of Antioch begins to centralize the church as a Eucharistic community gathered around the bishop in the early 2nd century, Rome probably did not see a bishop before 120. Many scholars agree that a full monarchical conception of the episcopate is a 3rd century phenomenon. Basically, you start out with bishops who are also elders, and eventually you see a division between those offices. And probably you can imagine why and how. You've got Christians gathered in a big city with lots of little house churches. And as the house churches get bigger, they become sort of self-supporting congregations. And then you've got a mother church in the middle of them, and who's got kind of a pastor of pastors portfolio. And so it makes sense to talk about him as an overseer, whereas the presbyters, the elders, are, supervisors of local congregations. This gradually is what develops. Makes sense, right? But what you end up having is a diversity. And the Didache is a wonderful example of this. You've got this phenomenon of a prophet. And who the hell knows what to do with a prophet? They are bearers of divine messages, and they're important because of that, but they're also a nuisance because they're mucking up decency and good order. They come in and they mess things up in terms of organizations. Also, there are prophets, like there are charismatic prophets today, who prophecy for money. So prophet is P-R-O-P-H-E-T and P-R-O-F-I-T all at once. And so the Didache is saying, okay, if a prophet comes in, he's allowed, because he's an oracle of God, to celebrate the liturgy and use his own liturgy and use his own words even. He doesn't have to read from a manual or a text. So he's got lots of independent kind of authority. But then the Didache says, if he stays too long, get rid of him. If he asks for money, get rid of him. And you see the ambiguity of the role of a prophet. A messenger of God, but don't stay off my lawn. Is sort of the attitude of it, and you begin to see how the waxing and waning of these offices as the church develops into its fuller self. Now, what's interesting, and I hinted at this last night, Vincent of Lerone, and Newman makes a good deal of this when he talks about the prophetical office of the church as a balance to the apostolical office of the church. Newman is borrowing from Vincent directly and says that the work of the prophet survives in the theologians of the church. So that theologians are prophetic figures who form a kind of tension in their relationship to the apostolical office of bishops. So that theologians develop doctrine, and the bishops of the church are kind of referees that decide whether or not those are true developments in doctrine, true senses of the faith, or false senses of the faith. Because prophets can be true prophets, but also false prophets, right? Who decides whether it's a true prophecy or a false prophecy? Well, the bishops of the church fill that role. Alternatively, kings can go nuts. You think of Ahab in the Old Testament, who becomes an idolater following his wife Jezebel. And God has to raise up Elijah to bring the word of the law of the Lord to the errant, Ahab. Or you think of David falling into adultery with Bathsheba, who confronts the king who has gone astray. This king who has all the authority and who has these divine titles ascribed to him. Well, it's the prophet Nathan who comes in and confronts David with his sin. And Vincent and then Newman say that sometimes theologians do exactly that kind of role vis-a-vis errant bishops and even errant popes. And if you want to understand one of the great reasons to make Oscar Romero a saint is because Oscar Romero is this ultimate contradiction of a kind of hegemony that existed at Rome that had no place for liberation theology in its midst. Liberation theology has lots of tendrils, and some of them are healthy and some of them are unhealthy. But if there's anybody who was a hero and who was emblematic of all the best features of liberation theology and who lived it out to the point of martyrdom, it was Romero. and Romero is a nice voice confronting, a compromised hierarchy, a compromised episcopate, a compromised magisterium. That's one of the reasons why I love him. So anyway, there you go. But you have this consolidation, basically lots of diversity in terms of clergy too that becomes consolidated in this three offices of bishop, priest, and deacon. Last bit here is the same narrative but much shorter. You have an incredible amount of liturgical diversity in early Christianity. The Didache basically says that the prophet, when he comes to town, can say Mass any way he wants, using any words he wants. Paul talks about a more or less stable tradition that has been handed on to him in 1 Corinthians. I received from the Lord that which I also handed on to you, that on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, blah, 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 blah. Do this in remembrance of me. But, when you ask, okay, well, what are the basic features of the Eucharist even? Bread and wine. Other food, yeah, we can imagine big banquets where there were bread and wine as well. But, Mass is nothing if it's not bread and wine, right? Well, Andrew McGowan recognizes that there are what they call ascetic Eucharists in early Christianity where there was no wine. It was a bread and water Eucharist. Different scholars point to the loaves and fishes story, the feeding of the 5,000 in John's Gospel, and say that this gestures at what potentially, and they look to this famous fresco and say that this is evidence of what might have been at one time a bread and fish Eucharist. So just the ordinary elements of bread and wine, what could be irreducibly Eucharistic? Well, it seems that there was an awful lot of diversity there. You look at different liturgical traditions that emerged from the early Christian movement that kind of formed into what we think of as the stable Eucharistic liturgy that survives from the Old Testament, the Canon of Rome and things like that. Lots of diversity, lots of differences in the way people pray. The canon of, or the Eucharistic prayer of Adai and Mari, for example, a very ancient Christian prayer, doesn't have the words of institution. So can you imagine a priest getting up to Mass and not saying, "This is my body, this is my blood, do this for the remembrance of me"? If you did that today, everybody would be on the phone to their bishop going, "Hey, bishop, you've got a heretical priest that's celebrating invalid Masses." a couple years ago, one of these, Eastern Orthodox churches that was trying to find some fellowship with Rome said, listen, we use the anaphora of Adai and Mari. It doesn't have an institution narrative. Is that okay? And Rome had to step in and say, excuse me, yes, it's okay for you to use this prayer without this is my body, this is my blood. Well, this is a witness and sort of a recognition of the actual diversity that existed in early Christianity. So, this diversity, again, like all these diversities, begins to kind of consolidate. And what happens is communities that were persecuted and isolated from one another are no longer persecuted and isolated from one another. The Christianity becomes the religion of the empire. The bishops are finally able to come together in council and talk to one another. They're able to copy one another's books. They're able to benefit from the teaching of one another. They're able to consolidate the church's faith. So that, and this is the big payoff of this whole presentation and the thing to take home with you tonight, that we talk about believing in a Catholic and apostolic Christianity, right? We believe the faith of the apostles. We believe the faith that the church has received universally. Where do we find that faith? Where do we find that practice? Where do we find the clerical embodiment of that, the liturgical embodiment of that faith? Well, our Protestant brothers and sisters always want to say, it's got to be in the Bible. Sola Scriptura, right? But the Catholic Church and Orthodox Christianity and Anglican Christianity and people that think straight all recognize that, yeah, you start with the Bible, to be sure. This is the inscripturated revelation of God. But we don't get it, as a dispensation from heaven. Immediately. It comes to us as the product of a canonical process that's assembled over time. Scripture is a product of tradition, right? Our liturgy doesn't get handed down as a missile that pops down out of the sky. It's the product of assimilation and experimentation and a developed way of worshiping God. It's traditioned. Our clergy, didn't pop out like zombies from the grave. Orders are the product of traditioning and development. And this is where the women's ordination issue kind of pops in. You sort of say, gosh, what happened to women functioning in prominent roles? Well, orders, the whole concept of holy orders as a sacrament is a product of traditioning and development and partakes. Now, can we develop it further and recognize that women can be ordained to bishop and priest? Potentially. Because there's witness that maybe they played roles a lot like that at some point in our past. Could they not again? Very possibly that development is possible. But whenever we talk about believing in an apostolic and Catholic faith, whether we talk about embodying that liturgically, observing that in terms of clerical leadership, in terms of confessing doctrines of the faith that we ultimately derive from the Scriptures, or whether we're talking about just the Scriptures themselves, the place we're looking is not in the sub-apostolic period, the time immediately after Jesus and the disciples. We're looking at the 4th century. That's how we read the Bible. So that if you pick up the Bible and read it as a Eutychian document, or as an Apollinarian document, or as an Arian document, you've misread the Bible, is what the church says. So if we're looking for apostolic faith, if we're looking for the Catholic faith, we find it in the 4th century. It is the product of the development